While we know standardized sizes don't work, we don't realize just how much damage they've done. It goes far beyond just finding clothing that fits, or even the impact on our body image. Turns out our quality of clothing and even our ability to know what quality is were victims of that system as well. A few years ago, I did a video on the history of standardized sizes, but I focused mainly on how the system was developed in order to benefit the industry at the time. But I've been gathering bits and pieces of the story ever since to understand how the adoption of standardized sizes has affected us, the consumer. It turns out, in an effort to make clothing easier and cheaper to produce by way of sizes, the industry placed the burden, the fallout, on the customers. Then they realized they could monetize that too. And the more failures, the more products sold. Because we generally don't think it's the product that failed. We tend to blame it on ourselves. It's not a recent story. This stretches back more than a century, which means that we as a society have forgotten what it was like before. We've normalized blaming ourselves, but in order to fix that, we need to know how it broke. So let's look at the story of standardized sizes and how exactly they left us with closets full of junk. If we go back to the 18th century and beyond, clothing was personal, custom, and it wasn't sized. It didn't even include measurements. In the case of mantua makers, dressmakers, the fabric was draped on the body and sculpted and molded around it. In the case of tailors, they used measuring tapes that had little notches in them instead of numbers. So if your clothing didn't fit, it was the fault of the maker, and you just simply went and found a different one. Tailoring was one of the most common trades, after all. Additionally, customers most often purchased their own supplies and fabrics, so they were intimately familiar with the quality as well as the process of making. In purchasing their own fabrics, they knew the source, where things had been woven, how they had been processed, what they were made of. Therefore, they knew what the quality was, and so people were often buying not just for what was fashionable, but what was better quality. More money got you better quality, and you just simply knew where your budget lay. In fact, fabric generally was considered so valuable that it was often passed down through the generations and remade over and over again. Quality was considered an investment. It's hard today to find fabric that could survive a few years of wear, let alone generations. How we care for it can be part of that, though. It's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that the sponsor for today's video is Lumi. Lumi deodorant is a whole body deodorant for wherever your body needs it. And I do mean wherever. Because the sweat glands in your armpits are other places too. In fact, Lumi was actually invented by OBGYN Shannon Klingman. I put a lot of effort into making my clothes, but that's not going to stop me from actually wearing them. Which means I need to make sure that I'm prepared for whatever the day throws at me, without worrying about working up a little sweat. And Lumi is clinically proven to block body odor all day and continues controlling BO for 72 hours. It also doesn't stain my clothing and leave all that awful buildup behind. It's skin safe, baking soda free, cruelty free, vegan, pH optimized to use wherever on your body. And they have everything from regular stick deodorant to cream, spray, wipes, and even body wash. So whether in the shower, getting dressed, or already out and about for the day and needing a quick touch-up, there's an easy option. If you do one of their starter packs, you get to try out a range of different types. They even have 8 different scents, including unscented, so you can test out all the variations. Cool cucumber and clean tangerine are super fresh. Lavender sage smells just like my garden. Fresh alpine for the perfect winter vibe, and toasted coconut frankly smells like an actual cookie. Or just go with the classic soft powder. Lumi's starter pack bundle is great for new customers. It comes with a full-size stick deodorant, a cream deodorant or a spray deodorant, 2 free products like the wipes or mini body wash, free US shipping, and just for my followers, an extra $5 off when you click the link in the description and use the code Nicole at checkout. That's a deal of over 40% off. Thanks again to Lumi for sponsoring today's video. Today, we as customers rely on sizes to help us find clothing on the rack or online. But that wasn't the original reason. Sizes developed in the 19th century as a way to help the industry transition to ready-made instead of custom clothing. But it would be a while before our current system of shopping would be set up. In fact, even department stores in the late 19th century operated with all of their goods behind counters, behind closed doors. You can see in plenty of photographs from the era that they would place the garments on mannequins, not unlike we do today. Anything else you were looking for would come out of other hidden spaces by way of the employees. There was simply one garment on a mannequin of each style, not multiple sizes out there available for you to filter through. For that reason, sizes weren't what we're used to today. They were more often measurements or even kind of personal secret codes that each business used, so they were far from consistent. The measurement size system worked well for garments that weren't terribly fitted at all or only had one place of fit. So things like undergarments that were unfitted and oversized were a pretty good example of this. Even things like shirts that the collar has to be fitted, but there's not too many other concerns, or socks, petticoats, basic fit garments that had adjustability built in, or at the very least didn't have to fit just perfectly. Yes, corsets are an example of one of the undergarments that was sold in sizes. They sold by waist measurement. However, corsets in the 19th century came in such a broad range of proportions and shapes and styles and purposes that you simply looked for what was going to work for your body first and then found the right size. So generally, if you look at clothing from the 19th century, gowns, suits, you won't find sizes inside. It's very unusual to find sizes in complex fitted garments like that. Because even if those were ready-made, they generally weren't left to the customer to figure it out. They didn't need the sizes printed or labeled inside. The customers instead would walk into a place like a department store and get measured and have the clothing brought out to them that they were interested in. So the trained employee is the one that would be able to translate the measurements into what size they needed to bring out, knowing what would fit and what could be adjusted. Because it was rare that there was an assumption that ready-made clothing was just going to fit you and be good to go when it came to the complex stuff. Even in the early formats of men's suits being ready-made, they'll still mention we can have it ready-made in a few hours, which means that they have parts of it already made up, or they have most of it finished. They just have to get inside and make the last few adjustments to the shoulders, the seams, the hems, in order to finish the garment. So there's an assumption that you're not walking out with these garments finished, ready to go, dealing with whatever fit problems might arise. Instead, the stores that you're buying them from, especially department stores, would offer things like alterations. Yes, some people might choose to take them home and do that themselves. Plenty of examples of that. Sewing was a basic skill at the time, making clothing a little bit more complicated, but knowing how to do alterations and other basic things like hemming, certainly. Clothing wasn't meant to fit off the rack. It was meant to be adjusted to fit or be something that didn't have to fit if it was supposed to come directly off the rack. And you can see just how common these sorts of adjustments were simply by looking at the interior of garments from the late 19th century. You can not only see a lot of alterations that have been made on most of these garments, but especially in the case of women's garments, which needed to be fitted very closely to the body for a lot of years, they have a lot of adjustment points and they're open and available. When you look inside of these bodices, you can see the seams. They aren't cleanly tucked away. They're meant to be easily adjusted. Even things like tailored pieces where, yes, there is a full lining, tailors were still incredibly common in that era, and it's not difficult to pull open a little bit of the lining and work some adjustments from the interior. So that was something that you can literally see in the clothing was built in to happen. But for the most part, that's something that was offered in those stores and people took advantage of that. That also meant that the employees that were assisting them could also be trained in so many other matters. What would work best for the situation, the event, the style, the color of their hair and their eyes, what's going to flatter their body shape the best in terms of the current styles, what they need that's going to function well for their purpose. Is it going to wrinkle a lot? Is it going to be too heavy? Or do they need something that's going to last for a really long time and be a high quality piece? That's where the employee came in to help guide them through that process. They were, yes, a salesperson and certainly wanted to make the best sale that they could, but the best way to do that was by helping the customer get exactly what they needed, and they'll want to keep coming back, especially keep coming back to that one person. So the educational process was part of it. However, catalogs were becoming the new problem in a way. Early versions would ask customers to send them their measurements. They wouldn't have a size range written down unless it was the measurement sizes. Instead, something as complex as a suit or a gown, you would send in your measurements, and somebody at the other end, another trained employee, would choose what's going to work best for you. In some cases, they just had a certain number of styles and colors, and you picked which one you wanted, and they made it to your measurements. Is it going to be nearly as perfect as having it custom made in person? Probably not, but it's still pretty good and a good deal cheaper because of the limited style options. However, those trained employees couldn't offer advice. They couldn't tell someone what sort of fabric they should be purchasing, what sort of colors would work best for them. That part is left out of the equation. Garments, however, were still commonly listed in catalogs with a lot of information talking about what sort of textiles they're made out of, the origins of those textiles, very complex descriptions of their weaves and finishes, names of fabric which we have long stopped using and generally forgotten. Not that they don't exist, we just don't call them that anymore. We've created a more general terminology. Wool is just wool. There's very few types that we tend to specify, whereas in these old catalogs there are dozens of different types. So customers, even if they couldn't handle things in person, still knew pretty closely what sort of fabric they were going to be getting and what the quality would be like. There were also clear differences in cost based on the quality of the components. So something like a Sears catalog would have multiple types of coats available, but they'd be different price ranges, and it would talk about why that was the case. That the quality of the goods went up, the quality of the wool or the trimmings went up, hence the price of the clothing went up. It wasn't a fancier designer name, it wasn't made by any different people, it was just better quality goods, therefore the price went up. So at least in theory, you knew exactly what your money was supposed to be getting you. But just like catalogs were using imagery to showcase a wide variety of products that were available, advertisements full of pictures started showing up in magazines and newspapers as well. Images could be printed in a quality and quantity never before seen, which means that we were viewing the products and the products on people rather than just descriptions and lists like advertisements of the previous centuries. A new emphasis was placed on the rapidly shifting styles and trends and the visual aspects of the product, with fewer and fewer words added in to talk about quality. Advertisements were selling you a look and a feel rather than an education. By the late 19-teens, faster and cheaper products coincided with the rise of ready-made clothing as the more common option, which made sizes even more necessary. Most production wasn't done in-house by the company that was actually selling it. Instead, they were manufactured by jobbers, large factory manufacturers who sold the things that they made to numerous different stores. And they were located further and further outside of cities in order to access cheaper labor, instead of things being produced literally in the department store like had been very common for many decades. And having size systems helped keep that communication clear between the various different groups that were working to manufacture these clothing items. Clothing of this era, however, was often very thin and unstructured compared to previous decades. This was the case for both men and women. Fewer layers inside of garments means that the production process is much easier. Things can be machine stitched or even glued together inside, rather than dealing with a lot of finicky hand stitching in order to get complex layers to play nicely together. Less structure also doesn't just make it easier to produce, it also makes it easier to fit. A simple tube of a dress in one thin layer only really needs one measurement in order to be able to fit correctly, and takes very little effort to do so, and therefore can be easily purchased by size. Since these clothing items were also being made more quickly and cheaply, and made out of less stuff, that also meant that stores could purchase more goods to be sold, have a wider variety of options in store, while spending roughly the same amount of money that they had before on a few very complex pieces. So department stores started putting out extensive racks of clothing, too many to hold behind a counter, in drawers, and in back rooms, and instead people were able to peruse through these racks themselves, looking for sizes that now had to be applied to these garments in some format. So while customers could get their clothing for lower prices, theoretically, they were doing so with less and less assistance, and with more and more examples of what we today would call fast fashion. No longer did the process involve a theoretically unbiased and educated opinion, guiding the customer through their broad options of price and quality. Instead, companies relied on the customer, or more likely, the advertisements, to do that work. A great example of this comes from the textile advertisements in the 19-teens and onwards. Instead of advertising a product you could simply go buy as a finished product, they were trying to advertise for you to go buy clothing made out of these new textiles. So many companies had come up with their own versions, their own names, had branded these types of textiles to say, we have a better quality, we have better options, we're more fashionable, we're more trendy, whatever it was, and they advertised that sort of thing. Whether they were brand new types of things like rayon, which wasn't its first name, or whether it was just newly fashionable old fabrics like jersey knit. The textiles are being sold as trendy and fashionable, and paying more money got you more novelty and interest rather than simply more quality. In the world of sizes, a new problem was also developing. Customers were growing accustomed to shopping for themselves, meaning that they were seeing all of the different sizes that were being applied. And stores had started to realize pretty quickly that people were starting to assign a value to those numbers, and that people had emotional reactions to what their size was. All stores had to do to get more people in was use vanity sizing. If there were 3 stores selling similar products in town, you were a size 10 in one, a size 8 in another, and size 6 in the third, they found that people wanted to go shop at the one where they were the smaller size. Vanity sizing was introduced in full force, and that became a big problem very quickly. There's only so far that you can go with this. So it was around the 1930s point that they started to look into ways of standardizing the sizing to make it more consistent across the industry. In 1939 in the US, they did a survey in order to start building that structure up, figuring out what common bodies were in the country. Now, granted, they only looked at 10,000 women in the entire US in 7 states, and it's no surprise in 1939 that they really only looked at white middle-class women. They did go for a decent age range to it, but that was pretty much the only thing that they seemed to figure out in terms of demographics. The rest completely left out. So in terms of standardized body proportions that we still use today, mind you, it hasn't changed or been updated. It's based off of a very small percentage of the population that is not representational at all. Men had the same issue. A lot of the early measurements were based off of military. They already had body measurements taken for looking at things like health and growth, as well as figuring out uniforms in the military, and therefore they utilized those systems that were already in place. So a lot of menswear has mostly been based off of the bodies of young men in their teens and 20s in the 1930s and 40s. Again, not at all representational of the broader population. But it worked well enough at the time because it was meant as suggestions, assistance, not regulations and rules. This was meant to help companies better understand the variety of body shapes and styles, to look at what there was out there and start extrapolating, because companies weren't supposed to sell based off of the national market. They were most often local or maybe regional, and they were supposed to adjust their styles, their cuts, their colors, their weights of fabric, as well as their size ranges based on what types of customers they personally had. So this was just meant to be a form of assistance and extra information, more so than a large-scale system that would never be changed. One of the immediate downsides to this was because there was now this new fancy scientific system telling them what the most common sizes were and how that sort of bell curve worked, they could easily decide to chop off the two ends. Those customers are much fewer and far between. It's a lot harder to sell things of that size to fewer people. It's really easy to just stick to the middle where we know we have customers. Then we can buy fewer sizes of each garment, therefore more garments, therefore have more options and keep selling to that middle group that will keep coming back. So they chose to make their customer range smaller and their product range larger, because the reality of standardized sizes wasn't that it was meant to help the customer figure out what they're doing. It was meant to help the manufacturer speed up and streamline and make their process more efficient. Easier sales, more consistent production, and more efficient shopping systems meant that they could sell more. And then the more you sell, the less the quality matters, because as long as some things are good quality, people will just keep coming back. If it's cheap enough and available enough, it won't matter if it's poor quality nearly as much. People are willing to ignore that and keep purchasing more as long as it's readily available. So they started to really shift towards the model that is the modern day fast fashion concept in their own way at that time. It's not quite what we're used to today, but it's definitely setting the groundwork for it. Because the reality is what truly would have helped customers of the time was more assistance. Having more employees who were well trained and educated in how to help people buy better clothing for them. But it's much cheaper and easier to force the customer to do it themselves. And frankly, it's a lot easier to manipulate them into buying what you want through advertising than putting that money into a few employees. There was a brief mid-20th century effort to teach the basics of garment construction and quality, but only to a very limited group, girls, and as a hobby more so than as a life skill. Sewing as a hobby only lasted for a really short time at its peak. It's obviously still around, but it's nowhere near as commonly taught or as popular and widespread as it was in the mid-20th century. And even then, the usefulness of the skill was diminishing very quickly as production and materials of factory-produced clothing were increasingly unlike homemade clothing. So while I can look at garments from, say, the 1920s, and it can be difficult sometimes to tell whether something is homemade, custom-made, or mass production, it becomes increasingly easy as time goes on. There are specialized machines that are only found in mass production factories. Things like blind hammers that you just don't commonly see in a home, nor do you see it being used in custom, which does work by hand instead. So the types of materials that were being used, the variety of options, the machinery, the construction techniques in order to do speed of construction over the ability to adjust the clothing meant that being able to sew your own clothing was less and less useful in knowing how to purchase mass production clothing. There were also more and more new fabrics. Textiles were constantly being invented, new fibers were being invented, and the range of names, both branded and not, became very extensive. We left behind a lot of the older terms for natural fibers and picked up a wide range of new ones for synthetically manufactured. And more importantly, you rarely see those names make it to the finished product. So while something might mention that it's made out of wool, it won't specify what type of wool. It won't specify what type of polyester, or what weave, or specifically what sort of finishing process is added, unless it is an aesthetic element to the garment. So we don't tend to use those names unless they are branded names, like using Tencel rayon instead of just rayon. So because we've stopped really educating, and because things have become more and more complex, we've lost our knowledge on how to buy quality and how to sew to adjust the fit of things. More importantly, we lost our knowledge on how to know if something is even fit properly to begin with. And then we generally just feel uncomfortable about something and blame our bodies instead of the clothing, which is perhaps either poorly designed in some cases, unable to fit a large range of body shapes, or just simply not what works for us personally, and it's no one's fault. And even in the case of people like me who know how to sew, who know how clothing should fit and how to alter it, doesn't really make a difference when the vast majority of modern clothing is produced in a way that makes it almost impossible to adjust. One of my standards for good quality clothing is to look at whether they allow that or not. If the seams are incredibly small and tiny, they are trying to save on every little bit of fabric that they can. It's really difficult to alter that. But if something like a pair of trousers has extra fabric in the center back seam or a really deep hem, well, that implies that they're willing to put in a little bit of extra money into that garment. Therefore, they're clearly making an investment in their customers. The intention for it to be altered or alterable, which implies that this is meant to be a longer-lived piece. So it generally speaks to better investment pieces. For the most part, though, companies rely on the fact that it's easier to buy a new thing than to fix or alter something. It gets a hole, loses a button, something rips, we're more likely to just go buy another than to take the time to fix that piece because it's not enough of an investment, it's not quality enough. If one part has started to fall apart, it's likely to just keep going. Sizing systems made this possible. They allowed the production of clothing to move further and further away from us, not just geographically, but also in terms of our knowledge. We rarely know where the textile is made anymore. We barely even know where the clothing item is made. We just have a country, which doesn't tell us very much. Even just getting an accurate list of the types of fibers in a piece of clothing is difficult enough. They're hidden away on the website and sometimes intentionally misleading or completely made up. And while technically there are regulations that say you can't lie on the product label, it gets a little bit more of a gray zone with the title of a product or what's on the website. And even with something like 100% cotton, it's very difficult to know if the quality is a 3-wash cotton or a 300-wash cotton. There's no system that regulates the difference. Something like organic doesn't mean anything. How it's processed and grown is almost never mentioned. And even things like synthetics are incredibly unpredictable, not because they can't be produced in a very consistent fashion, but because they have such a wide range of possibilities. Polyester is extruded in infinite different varieties and woven in different ways to get different features. So while one polyester might actually be woven specifically to help wick moisture away from the body, that means nothing about the rest of them. So there's no consistency in the fiber, let alone the textile. And the chain of knowledge is so broken apart. Working just the short bit that I did in the industry, I worked as a designer who worked in direct contact with the manufacturer of the product, but they were the ones in a long distant country that went out and found the supplies. And they usually didn't get it from the manufacturer directly of that good. They got it through another middleman. So even manufacturers are rarely able to track that. So it's not like they could just add that information in. That's usually steeped in mystery as it is. And hence why you can buy something one year and it's great, and buy the exact same product in the exact same color from the same company the next year and it's not good quality because where they were getting their textile from had to change. There was only so much that was made of the first round. So sizing, standardized and in general, not only made this separation of the manufacturing process possible, it developed an entire industry that focuses on quantity over quality, on generic over personal, that has removed our understanding of our clothing and managed to make that our own responsibility rather than an expected part of their job. So we, as the consumer, are expected to know if the clothing fits, if it's good quality, how to adjust it, how to make things fit better, how to do all of the shopping ourselves. And what are they providing exactly? Less and less information. And honestly, there's still so much more to the story. So stick around because I am definitely going to be talking a lot more in the coming months about the clothing manufacturing process, how that has changed through history, and how today we are still dealing with the effects of things that happened decades or even hundreds of years ago that we've long since forgotten.